Yeah, welcome everyone. Good morning. I'm Brendan Carlin. This is the 5th session of the lecture series titled The Ambivalence of Design. It's organized by myself, James Kwang Ho Chung. We teach Diploma 19 at the AA. And it's in collaboration with Jun Sung and Jaewon Yi at Yonsei University in Seoul. And the event is a series of lectures and a series of workshops, which is funded by the British Council. Today, we're very excited to welcome Francesca Romana Dell'Aglio. She's an architect, writer, and educator, and she currently teaches history and theory at the AA, at the Architectural Association, and she runs design studios at Cambridge and the Royal College of Art. She's recently submitted her PhD on rituals, habits, and collective space in London. And just to say, Francesca, for probably about the last 5 years, has been a very inspiring and insightful critic for our unit. And she's led us down kind of enlightening rabbit holes with her complex and layered readings of the terms ritual, habit, and routine. And the ways that these categories might become, in a sense, lenses or tools for reading or practicing architecture. In her PhD work on ritual and habit in London, I think she's starting to expose some of the forces, phenomena, and practices that are kind of bubbling up from within the cracks of London's economic machine and threatening to transform the city into something a hell of a lot more interesting. So I know I'm really looking forward to reading that entire thesis. So yeah, we're thrilled to have you, Francesca. Thank you for coming and welcome.
Hi, can I put the microphone here? Yeah. That's gonna make a lot of noise now. Okay. Okay, thank you very much for the introduction and also for the invitation, Brendan and James. And also thank you for the summary of my thesis, quite amazing. I'm gonna write that down. I actually, yes, as Brendan mentioned, I recently submitted my PhD, and actually the invitation to this lecture series came while I was in the middle of it. So you can imagine. No, it's okay. No, you can imagine somehow how that can put you in a kind of weird spot in which you are on one side super excited that you're going to submit this thing that you've been working for so long, and on the other you kind of start wondering, okay, where do we move next? What can I do next with this thing? And so I found myself a little bit in this limbo. And then I decided also to take the opportunity somehow to start where the thesis ends. So somehow what you're going to see today is a bit of this. Also, I had the chance to look and to be here for the Branzi's lecture. And I kind of had this thought while I was looking at that lecture and about how we are so much influenced from the theories that have been put forward in the second half of the 20th century, essentially. So where Branzi actually is part of that way of thinking. So we have figures like Branzi, we had figures like Archigram here, but also we have the thinker of the new American urbanism in the US. And a thought kind of started coming in my mind because these are the theories that somehow on which my PhD grounds itself. And I was wondering, like, what did we learn from these theories if we are repeating them? And it seems that we have learned no lesson, or at least what we have taken from them is a sort of like almost graphic fetish of like the beautiful images that Archigram left or like Super Studio left, but even the beautiful images that Branzi showed to us. So, and what about all these theories and what about their impact on the way we look at architecture and the way we practice architecture? And so another thing made me think while I also was, and this is a thought that I had while I was writing, not reading the whole thesis, throughout the 5 years that took me, is that like to whom we're doing this thing for whom we're doing research, and for whom we are interested in saying something new or put some theories forward. And honestly, to me, the answer is pretty simple, and really did arrive quite late, not really at the beginning, but it's us in academia. So it's you students, and it's this beautiful way of setting a room like this and not like a lecture that I have to give a lecture. There's no way I'm going to give a lecture, or at least I'm going to give a talk, and I give some ways, I can instill some ways of thinking and some ideas, then you kind of bounce back at me with doubting at them and challenging them, maybe agreeing with them. I don't know. It's up to you. So essentially, so as I said, this series of thoughts that I'm gonna propose today originate from the PhD, but really detach from it and try to really, and I'm still in the process of clarifying them a bit, so bear with me. And the other thing also is that if you remember, Branzi said that architecture is thought and can be thought. So somehow this can be considered a sort of project, right? Like that I'm putting forward out for you, I'm presenting you, and then you're going to be, we're going to discuss it together somehow. And so as such, as a project and as a thought, we need to learn to embrace the importance of doubting also whatever we are going to be put in front somehow. So this is, which one is this? Which one I have to, sorry, James.
Just get the screen share going.
Yeah, it's I'm going, is this one? No, it was on purpose.
Oh yeah, no worries. I think, let me switch it round because I think we've got that one on.
Okay.
Sorry, give me a moment.
Thank you very much. Okay. So yeah, so the talk today is called An Invite to Transgress, which the first invite of this talk somehow is, as I was kind of saying before, I invite you to doubt. Not going. It's not moving. Maybe I should push this. No, this doesn't move either.
Yeah.
Now it moves. So to doubt, which essentially because I really wanted to put this, when Jean-Luc Godard died, of course, a series of interviews were published, like even old interviews. This was this particular one from the New Yorker in early 2000, where he already moved in this tiny little village in Switzerland where international deliveries don't happen. And he said this very banal, but very important thing, which is with the digital, doubt no longer exists. And it's very true if you think, because we are so used to open our phone and check whether something is true, whether something is right, whether there are proof of something that we have read. So we're constantly seeking for the truth, or for like a very binary way of looking at things. Doubt instead allow us to see things blurred and not to really necessarily look for that truth. And so, yeah, we don't walk in doubt, we don't design in doubt, we don't produce anything in doubt. We always seek for the truth. But doubt instead is extremely important for our intellectual growth. And somehow this is the second invitation of this series of this talk, which is to look at what we have in front. What we have in front not always is something that we can understand what it could be, but it can be challenged, it can be questioned, right? Like even a pile of rubbish can become something potentially interesting for us, with which we can actually work. And if we think like even can be this kind of potential for design, this potential way of looking at, but it depends somehow on the way we look at things, on the way we see potential in what exists in the environment that surrounds us. And this somehow, it's because we probably, especially in the moment of climate emergency like we are facing now, it's about maybe design is about working and designing with the environment and not for the environment. And that means that also, like, of course, the technological advancement of material is something that pertains the architectural discipline and especially the practice. But also, we can also design with the things that we find in front of us, right? Like, and that is part of it. And then we might even be surprised that a pile of rubbish can become a beautiful architecture or a spatial, somehow a spatial, become a spatial intervention. So somehow the way in which we can design with the environment begins with stopping and observing what we have in front, in looking before leaping into actually a design, like a design intervention. Because maybe we might even realize that once we observe something thoroughly, we might not even have to intervene at all. So that is also part of the design process. Because, and I really strongly believe this, especially in the context in which we are here today, which is the academic context, an act of design has and must focus on processes and not necessarily on outcome. But we are so eager to look at that end, at that truth, at that kind of final proposition that we can have that somehow synthesize our ideas and our thoughts into something. And we forget that there is a process that we undergo before actually arriving to that end. This means something extremely controversial for architects. It means to abandon the plan. The plan, not just the plan, firstly, let's say, as a drawing, maybe. So you'll tell me if you agree or not. But like architect has this tendency, if you think since modernism, to control. Like modernism is the moment in which architects kind of expand also to the public sphere and start saying like how it's good or bad to behave and to live. What's our right collective life and what's the right domestic life that people can actually perform. And if you think about that, there is this sort of constantly view from above that architects have, and the plan synthesize that view from above, that somehow can evoke these words that Agamben had for the apparatus itself. So it is something that controls a set of practices, bodies of knowledge, measures, and institutions that aim to manage, govern, control, and orient in a way that purports to be useful the behaviors, gestures, and thoughts of human beings. That's somehow the ambition of the architect, a little bit, even if it's not really exposed. It's an inner ambition that architects have. But the plan has to be abandoned not just as a drawing, but also as a verb. So this idea of the project, right? Like the project etymologically means to look forward, to kind of like, it looks at an end, etymologically speaking, and the plan is the means through which we get to look at that end. So this idea of planning is implicitly an idea of controlling something. But what about if we actually challenge that role of the architect? And this, if you think, I stole this from the Branzi video, but if you think is a bit what Branzi was really putting forward in that video, especially in that moment in which he spoke about, in this still, he spoke about Carmelo Bene. Carmelo Bene was this poet, I would say, like even if he worked a lot with theater, but he was really an incredible intellectual and a great writer and a great poet. And he was very controversial in the world of theater because he really was focusing on action and no scripts. He created a biennale and it was really in Venice and it was really controversial for that. But in that still, if you remember of Branzi, he says that there is no such thing as writing for the stage. There is just the action of the actor. So that is somehow a very interesting architectural invitation because we need to maybe learn to indulge in the act, in the process, and embrace the doubts, all the controversy, the friction that process can bring forward. because it's something, and again, that was Branzi that really used that word, maybe I remember wrong, but he really used that word incidental, right? Like accidents in daily life. And incidental is anything that is acted, that is performed and doesn't have a plan, is unpredictable, is uncontrollable. We cannot plan something that is incidental. It just happens. And there is one way we can probably do that. It somehow goes back to the pile of rubbish that I started with. And it's about going down to earth. Start to observing and looking around, because the plan, as I said, is something that allows us to see everything from above and have this kind of unified view of the world. But if we go down to earth, we embrace all these changes that society goes through in order to, and reflects the uncertainties in the built environment. I think this is quite well explained in this movie by Wim Wenders from 1987. It's called Wings of Desire. So this movie talks about a group of angels and a group of humans and angels, the life of these two kind of figures, categories. So the angels look and overlook the life of human from above. So they always see life from here. And sometimes they descend on earth to accompany human in their life until their death somehow. But there is one particular angel that falls in love with a woman. And so he struggles somehow. He sits in this limbo in which he is uncertain whether he can become a human or whether he actually can remain and stay an angel. But in the end, actually, he decides to become a human, and something beautiful somehow happens, because when he falls down to earth, he starts living and he starts encountering the world of humans. But most importantly, what Wenders does, which I think is brilliant, after the fall, we stop seeing the world in black and white, which is the world that angels see. So this kind of dichotomy of two colors, and we start seeing the world in color. And so he gets like completely shocked. And of course, he can then unify, go back to his loved one. So somehow architects need to learn to abandon that idea that the world is something that can be ordered. The world is not an orderly place. Actually, the world is a world that resists ordering in favor of complexity. So the world, it cannot be, it is exactly what, again, is something that Branzi also said. And that's why I was really starting with the idea that what did we learn from these theories? They will constantly say these things to us, and we're still not responding to that complexity. There is another author that I think is beautifully explained this complexity of the world through this beautiful drawing. If you never encounter Marco Frascari work, I really recommend you to have a look at him, because he was an amazing educator in one sense. He wrote beautiful book, especially about the art of drawing for architects. So drawing as an act of thinking. But also in his books, if you look at them, there is always a text, and this text is always summarized with a drawing. And it's beautiful because we always have this constant check almost of what we understand in words and what can be represented in drawings. He talks about this drawing, particular drawing that is a knot. It's called the knot as an holy icon. But a knot somehow symbolizes the complexity of reality, maybe. And he described this drawing by saying this: analyze and describe this tangle as it exists. An impenetrable, unsolvable, knotted snarl phenomenon, entangled with causes, concomitant causes, and causes of causes. It is essential to acquire a real operative condition to observe it and to question it, to inquire on its nature, without untangling the knot of the cognitive cluster, but rather our finer perception, reaching an infinite number of relations. And this is exactly what we have to do, I think. So that is somehow part of that process of stopping and observing, right? Like, and we can't intervene in a reality without understanding what that reality is about. And that is essentially what architecture is. It's not an imposition from above, but really start from this analysis. And this kind of difficulty to look at architecture as something complex, as opposed to as something that can be controlled, derive from a confusion. And if you read Jeremy Till from today, for that somehow is one of the readings that I suggested for today's session, he actually talks about a confusion of architecture as intended as a metaphor, as opposed to an architecture intended as reality. But again, if we go back to modernism, the city has too long relied on metaphor, on analogies and planning processes, rather than actually then the specifics of realities that constituted of different communities, cultures, and belief, hence different spatial practices all along. A very excellent example of this is probably, are we okay?
I think it's fine.
Shall I stop? Or shall I go? Let's go.
Yeah.
Well, we don't believe alarms anymore. So Ungers, so this is one of a work by Ungers, in which called city metaphors, very self-explanatory. But what is interesting that he constantly compare an urban plan with an image, starting from this plan of the Manhattan plan. So every infrastructure of the city can be translated in a biological infrastructure of the human body. And it goes on somehow in seeing like cities and translating these cities into images that can be reachable, understood, can be understandable, and can be immediately recognized. So that is the metaphorical process. But before arriving at that metaphor, which is the ultimate stage of the design process, if we want to think about it, instead of actually being a process on itself of synthesizing an idea of architecture, there is something else that Marco Frascari again put forward, and this is this idea of cosmopoiesis. Cosmopoiesis is a combined word combined of two Greek words. Poiesis means creating, and cosmos, self-explanatory, is the cosmos, is the world. So in one word, in a very blunt translation, is this act of world making. And that somehow Marco Frascari talks about this act of world making, not just as an artistic gesture, but really as an act of embodiment, of interpretation of reality that is subjected to doubts and mistakes. Why is so? And he goes and explains this process of cosmopoiesis. And again, he uses a drawing, which I find, again, quite remarkably intelligent and good. It's somehow we can call it a sort of metaphor similar to Ungers, but there is so much to read in this drawing. And next to this drawing is always a description that really untangle that knot. So in this drawing, we see, it's called templum. So we have a templum, a temple somehow, so like from different angles. And the drawing is divided into three strips. There is a ground, which is in the middle of the drawing. There is an underground level, and there is a sky level. He explained the drawing like this. That which appears at ground level could be interpreted as the face value of the templum, or the literal reading that can be physically apprehended, perceived, and surveyed by someone perusing the site. So it's the reality, right? Is that not? Is that what we see and that is surrounded, is the environment. That which lies underground relates to a deeper history grounding the story, the structure, and reflecting the moral value of the reading, the history and theory somehow, like we dig into something, what we see, and then we try to understand the site, the history of the site, who before the stratigraphy, the complex stratigraphy that a site actually sits on. And then eventually the templum in the sky offered the reading of the metaphorical significance. But only once we went through the first two levels, we can reach the metaphorical significance. So the design process somehow is made of all these three stages. We cannot like skip steps somehow in this design process. And it's something that Jeremy Till somehow borrows a little bit. And when he talks that to have a vision means to be adjusted to circumstances, the making of a choice is neither relativist nor determinist, because we enter into those choices as sentient, knowing and situated people, not as innocents abroad in the detached knowledge of others. Think about this way, architects are citizens before being architects. And as such, we are part of something that is the same thing that we're going to go to intervene on. So we have this kind of double knowledge somehow, but we tend to forget that we are also this somehow a subject that it's with which we have to dialogue somehow. We are part of that subjects that we need to dialogue with. So, and this is very important, especially for us in the world of education, the people that decide like us to teach and stay in education, because it's very important to realize that idea of architecture, of controlling something, allow us to think for a long time that architecture is one single knowledge. But that is not true. It's actually related to many forms of knowledge. It spans from tectonics, so this kind of like anything that actually is more technical, but also something that is extremely theoretical, like anthropology in one hand. Which is why the architect needs to dialogue with these other fields, because we are part of a wider social field somehow. If you think like architecture doesn't rely on one single knowledge, think about this, on one single knowledge. Why? Think about this. If we think about engineers or like the profession of the engineer and the way we study engineer, we apply rules because a building cannot fall. Right? It's a science. Architecture is not just a science, or is not science, essentially, because we don't apply rules, right? Like the difficulty and the crisis of identity that architecture has always gone through today is even more perceivable. So that's why probably we need to somehow try to find and reinvent a little bit our place in the plethora of disciplines in the world that look at the world. And there is a beautiful sentence, I think, about Jeremy Till, and I don't know if you find it entertaining in the book, but I really love the way he writes, and I love the way he explains things, because I think it's an academic book, but it's extremely digestible, right? So it's quite beautiful, I think, in that way. But there is this, how he makes fun of architect, and he's an architect, so he makes fun of himself as well. But he says that architect needs to give up their delusions of autonomy and engage with others in their messy, complex life. It's funny that he talks about architect as a tribe a little bit. So we dress the same, we go to the same restaurants and cafes, we all behave the same. But why? Like that, this doesn't make any sense, right? So again, that's a delusion of autonomy a little bit. I think it's a funny way to look at it. So architects, So architects therefore need to learn to let go of the fears of the other, of chaos, and transgressions. Today, the architect ought to forget architecture as an act that imposes order on a way of living to make legible and coherent and contaminate such necessity of order with the reality of the social political contingencies of our existence and with the practices of the people and society as they happen out in the street. In one word, we can summarize all of these contingencies as the everyday. Architecture as a practice and as a theory should be part of a network of disciplines and not pretend to have control over various disciplines. Dealing with the everydays implies being humble and instinctive. The everyday is the most sincere architecture, but has been rarely considered the terrain for architecture intervention. There has been always a famous quote by Nikolaus Pevsner, I think in a book called Architecture Without Architects, with him, in which he talks about the distinction between a bike shed and a cathedral. And he says, like, the bike shed is a building. The cathedral is architecture with a capital A. But how many times did we actually deal with a cathedral more than a bike shed? We actually deal more with a bike shed. So that, again, why doesn't have to have the dignity to be considered an architecture? And this somehow goes back to Branzi again, which again, if guess what, we are in the same, more or less same periods in the 1980s, people were considering acting in an important project. So this is Michel de Certeau, and he says that the everyday is an act and not a plan. It is a tactic of resistance against capitalist production. And this somehow is a response to that famous phrase of Walter Benjamin when he says that capitalism becomes religion. Capitalism is religion because flattens everyday life, flattens the distinction between the cyclicality of the everyday life and the exception of any kind of activity, the ritualistic activity that we do in exceptional moment of our life. Capitalism flattens everything. So if we actually, a way to resist to that, it actually is to insist on the importance of an act. And the everyday is the place where we act, is our stage somehow. The everyday has been summarized, or the way we behave, the way we come together and we live our everydays is summarized into two main words by anthropologists at least. And architects use these two words really a lot and not with much understanding of the two words, I think, or at least that understanding of the two words are very borrowed from the dictionary meaning of these two words. So these two words, in fact, are considered in the contemporary understanding of ritual and habits, have been considered to oppose each other. So ritual is something that is religious or solemn, is something that is a prescribed order, or is a series of actions. So there is something ceremonial, something cultural, something important about rituals. Habit had nothing solemn, as nothing, never been considered so dignified as an action. Is actually a settled or regular tendency or practice, is addictive, and is even automatic. So habit is bad, ritual is good for the contemporary understanding of this. But if we think about these two actions, they are related to one another. Now, this is a very attempted diagram, which any anthropologist would look at it and probably think doesn't make sense. And I apologize, but it was a mind process for me to kind of give a meaning to this kind of relationship and how ritual and habit are two complementary actions. So essentially, they are both rooted in the ethos of a society. They both produce a cultural meaning for a society because they both begin with a belief intended as something that we all share. Remember that the word religion actually comes from the word Latin religare, which means bringing together. It means actually gathering together. Has nothing to do with actually believing in something superior, but is about sharing a value and sharing some belief again. So coming together means that we behave in a way, and that generates a sort of ritual. And once we start behaving, only once we start acting, we generate symbol, because if we use accessories and tools, which are part of a ritualistic practice, and we generate rule. And then we perform, we keep performing this series of action, following the same rules, following the same symbols, and we can repeat them. And here is where architecture enters the mix. And it's not entering the mix in a good way, because architecture somehow crystallizes all these beautiful ways of coming together and give to these ways of coming together, these behaviors that we perform, give it a form, right? Like decide that that way of behaving correspond to that type of architecture. And therefore, in that way, what it does, transform behaviors into praxis, into something that is easily recognizable, has a symbol that corresponds to that practice. And therefore, that way of behaving becomes legible, accepted practice or costume. In one very simple word in architectural terms, becomes a standard. And here we can enter another world that is the world of types and typology, and again go back to pointing our finger at modernism, probably. But I don't want to enter, that's another, of course, that goes to another kind of territory. But what is important for me, because this is part of my thesis, and I really don't want to go too much into it, but for me, what is important is to really understand that ritual and habit are part of the same world. They needs to be treated with the same respect, and not the one is good or one and the other is bad, because they're both part, that is a dichotomy, let's say, of a human condition, and they are part of the way we live. They are two different ways in which we live our life. But somehow they really, if we look at them carefully, they really generate or evoke that idea of circle or circularity that Walter Benjamin again was mentioning in Capitalism when he spoke about capitalism as religion, but he pushed forward in his famous arcade project. And in fact, he talks about the Immergleich, which is the ever self same, so this constant return of the same. And he says that in the capitalist production of commodities, the new and the novel stimulate the mind, but reintroducing meaning. At the same time, the process of repetition, organized from commodity production, imposes the eternal return of the same. In a world of stereotypes, standards, the question becomes knowing how to tear the new from the always the same. And this is our question. This is the question that architects need to ask. How can we avoid succumbing in this world of stereotypes and repetition of standardized form? And we can find we can find the new in what is always repeated as the same. Now it's probably good because I've given you lots of words, but it's a little example that I think is very brilliant. And again, not by chance, came out of a summer school here at the AA. So within a context of education, in a context of academia. And it's a project made by David Knight and Finn Williams in 2009 called Subplan. So this is a work by students. So David Knight is actually so Finn Williams was curated, I think, the British Pavilion together with Shumi Bose and Jack Self in 2014. David Knight is one of the founder of DKCM, which is one of the, I think, most brilliant architectural practices in London today. And I think really like this project was really interesting and really like echoes a lot of what DKCM do in their practice. Subplan is a series of studies that the student made of like a series of planning policies and housing regulations in the UK, and read these policies upside down, really like they really tried to understand all of these policies up to finding the right loopholes of these policies, really finding holes and things that actually have not much meaning and trying to fill that gap with something new, right? Like finding the new in what is always the same. And that like led them to kind of redact or like write again a new series of planning policies that somehow counteract to the existing planning policy and been all gathered in this lovely small publication. So this somehow is a way to allow the project of architecture to escape from the conventional realm within which it usually sits, meaning finding rules and norms to be interpreted first and then possibly subverted. But here is also when the idea of habit, again, can gain a little bit of a good potential connotation. And as something that is an acquired habit. And again, this is an author that I found after I submitted my thesis. And it's one of those moments in which you kind of put your fingers in your head and think like, oh my God, what I missed. But then it's beautiful because you realize that there is a sort of, it corroborates some of the things that you've thought. And that's why I wanted to put it here, because I thought it's a very interesting understanding of habit. And he's not the only one who makes this. So he says that an acquired habit is the consequence of a change. All change is realized in time, and what brings a habit into being is not simply change understood as modifying the thing, but change understood as occurring in time. So again, that idea of process comes back. It's not enough to just interrupt something, but we need to indulge in that act of interruption. So habit has all the more force when the modification that produces it is further prolonged or repeated. Habit is thus a disposition relative to change. You will never see such a definition in the dictionary because habit is addictive, is automatic, right? But here we're saying something completely different that is actually a disposition that allows change. But it's not enough to just interrupt and make that change happen. But we need to understand what is the potential of that change. And I find, again, sometimes I just put things in presentation, makes no sense, but I just like the way they sound. And I think that this quote, I mean, it's my translation, but since I read this quote, I really fell in love with it because I really think it gives an idea of what this means, right? Like the artistic process is not something, and architecture is part of an artistic process if we want. It's not something that just makes creates a shock, creates an interruption, right? Like creates something unpredictable, but it's something that generates a change, generates something new. We forget that as architects, that we can generate that change, even though we have that kind of delusion of autonomy. But he says Melotti was a Italian sculptor, and he wrote nothing but this little tiny book called Lines, published in the 80s, and it's a series of aphorisms, essentially. But what he says is this, that shock sits at the starting line, art is the journey. If I read a comic book with a telescope, if I move the bathroom sink in the living room, if I chop my head off and place it on a chair, I'd experience shock. But everything stops there when the discussion is yet to start. I think it gives really the idea of like how important it is not just to be shocking, not just to interrupt something, but to really like see what that interruption leads us to. So the interruption is a sort of suspension of overcome of our hierarchical ranks, privilege, norms, and prohibition. In one word, we can call into discussion the idea of transgression. So somehow an interruption is a transgressive act, and therefore design can be considered a sort of transgressive act that relies on a series of regulation, finds these loopholes eventually, but somehow contradicts, like is a violation, like etymologically can be considered a sort of violation of a law, of a rule or a code of conduct, right? But it's essentially transgression. What it means is something that opposes itself to an existing condition, to a status quo. And again, if we go back to anthropological studies, this exceptionality exists in a very specific time and spatial condition, which is called liminal condition in anthropological studies. Now, liminality is a word that really it's super clear, actually, it's not really controversial, but it's a word that started with Arnold van Gennep with his famous book called Rites of Passage. Rites of passage are passages of social status, right? Like, but even time changes, like New Year's, for instance. So there are different ways of rites of passage. And the moment in which we as human beings move from one state to the other, we are crossing a liminal condition. So somehow it's a boundary that we need to cross, right? There is another, though, anthropologist that take that concept and really push it forward and looks at this, and this is Victor Turner, so in the late 60s, 80s, actually. Victor Turner talks as a liminal condition as an anti-something, as an anti-structural condition, something that goes against society. Society intended as like the way we behave. So the liminal condition is something that allows us to go against that status quo in which we actually live and we got used to live somehow. So develops a sort of this idea with Victor Turner, liminality develops a connotation of an interruption to the natural flow of life, right? But there is another meaning of transgression, which is even more etymological. And that's why maybe it sounds very pedantic, but I really like to go into the etymology of words to really understand. Sometimes they really illuminate us because they really like give us something that we never thought it could be. It was just a thought, but then actually that confirms the thought. Transgredire in Latin means really going across. So another meaning of transgression is this idea of act of going beyond, which is beyond something that is generally accepted as a boundary. So in architectural words, this idea of liminality, it's spatially translated, or we can start seeing the spatial limitation of this translation of liminality into something that is a limit. Limes in Latin actually meant this idea of boundary. So it is a wall, right? Like it's not a space, it's just a line, essentially, either by the two-dimensional or three-dimensional, is just a line that we need to go across. So that's how we could probably immediately, what we could associate liminality with in spatial connotation. But what if instead we give it a different meaning, which is instead something, and again, we're going to go back to Walter Benjamin, it's something that instead of being a boundary, is more like a threshold. So it's a zone. He says the threshold, always in the arcade project, the threshold must be carefully distinguished from the boundary. A Schwelle, apologize my German. is a zone. So transformation, passage, wave, action are in the word, are in this very same word. So we can imagine this as a zone, and maybe within this zone is exactly that process, that design action that can actually take place, because somehow spatializing the liminal condition challenges it to be actually defined as a liminal condition, and brings us another word, which is what Tim Ingold, whom again was amongst the reading, give this as define this as an arterial condition, so a space of in between. And what he talks about this, he says that any movement in the between, and he makes this distinction between a between, which is more the boundary, that line, the liminal condition, and the arterial condition, the in between. So any movement in the between, like the undergoing that is framed in doing, or the growing framed in making, is merely from here to there, from an initial to a final state. In the in-between, however, movement is the primary and ongoing condition, where between is liminal, in between is arterial, where between is intermediate, in between is midstream. And he made a beautiful, in fact, metaphor of the river and the boat in the river. So the boat, actually, the ferry moves one person to the other, moves one person from one side of the river to the other side of the river. But actually, in between means that we dwell in the river. We kind of listen the waves of the water, and we actually we enjoy the moment in which we're actually crossing without thinking about crossing the river. So it's extremely interesting, and again goes back to that idea of the action, not something that again Branzi was put forward, but is life in the in-between is live attentionally, not intentionally. So this idea of looking at the end, knowing, not embracing the doubt, knowing the right or wrong, that is more intentional. But what about if we live it like with attention? That idea of attention, living attentionally, means that we can span this lifespan of this in-between process of this arterial condition can become a potential. So we live and we process and we can design in a state of potential. So transgression becomes a state of potential change. And in this state of potential change, maybe we can oppose that idea of standard and standardization that architecture so willingly somehow propose and contribute to create. So I'm going towards the end and going back to that idea that, like I was saying at the very, very beginning, about the importance of understanding who the audience is when you do something, when you produce something. And I think that really looking at design as an act of transgression, for me, can become an act of learning. So maybe it's also it's the place, academia is the place somehow, or like education is the place in which we can challenge the status quo of the practice. And maybe this is one proposal, one way to look at it, right? Like to look at the way we design intentionally and instead of like attentionally. And because academia is the moment in which, or at least the moment education, we are all, do you remember that Branzi said, like, which is not really a way of saying, but I really do believe in this. And I think we all believe in this, that we constantly learn from each other. But because we are mutually reliant, not just in terms of economic exchange, but also of intellectual exchange. And also within itself, ourselves as human being, when we see a rule, there is this tendency or an impulse to disobey something. Like we cannot necessarily get along with something. We can challenge something. You have to doubt something. We all have to learn how to doubt something in a good way, of course, not in a bad way. But like it's important to reflect on the possibilities that doubt can give us somehow. So the act of design, the standard conventional act of design, can be challenged and transgressed in education. When they tell you that is not a project, don't believe that, because it can be a project, right? So, and do you remember when Branzi, I really found that interesting and quite spot on. Academia is superficial, can be extremely superficial, because it doesn't reflect that complexity that reality actually is undergoing. So if you think even the model of education that we are actually subjected to, the distinction between theory and practice, Whereas instead, Branzi was saying that architecture can be a thought. Maybe it's not, that doesn't need to be so stark, that distinction. Maybe we can start blurring some of the boundaries together. Because somehow academia normally is based on decontextualized knowledge. So knowledge that don't depend on contingency. So we learn skills. We learn very well how to use AutoCAD. We learn very well how to use Photoshop and all of these things. But why? Do we question that? Like, do we have to, can we understand? These are just means. These are just tools. These are not the knowledge that necessarily we need to actually learn in a context like this. So we should embrace architecture as a process that allows disparities, frictions, tensions, realities, and hence problems to be faced, enabling them to find a space in the city and allowing different and new social relationships to emerge. We can call these contingencies, Jeremy Teal calls them contingencies, or situated and embodied knowledge, borrow from reality and the complex world that academia refuses to address. And architecture as a profession contributes to flatten and simplify. So using Frascari words, we learn new cosmopoietic act, and we challenge also the process of cosmopoiesis, because cosmopoiesis is an acquired habit that begins from a change, but an indulge in the act of process of change. And using Benjamin's words, sits between the dream world and the waking state. I want to conclude with two things. One is a short video by a student from Cambridge that I had the pleasure to work last year with, and really challenged a lot my research, my thesis. So I'm gonna, but before that, there is someone else's that have been worked with transgression in academia and in teaching, and it's someone called Bell Hooks. She unfortunately died, but she really believed in this in academia as a sort of moment of change, in that idea of change in the process of learning. And she said, like, to open our minds and hearts to think and rethink so that we can create new vision. I celebrate teaching that enables transgression, a movement against and beyond boundaries. It is precisely that movement which makes education the practice of freedom. I'll move on to the video. I think here's an audio.
Red man. Oh no, that person's the one making the face.
Crazy. I was like, what in the world are they doing? Here, let's go ask. Some strange invention. I used to do stuff like this. I don't know. Nice to meet you, buddy. And what's your name?
Ruben.
Ruben. Nice to meet you, Ruben. And yeah, good luck, man. Bye.
So you're going to be on the top, yeah? Grab that when it comes to you. So then it will kind of hold.
Oh yeah, we could just do it on one.
Yeah.
Yeah, but
Final. More?
maybe lifting a tiny bit.
Like one hand's worth.
Yeah, that's good.
There?
Yeah.
That's alright, I think.
Do like Michael Jackson They're like
So quick to put up.
Thank you.
I'm not sure how to ask it, but I was interested kind of in how you spoke about the plan as, in a way, the opposite of transgression, not the opposite, but you know what, like on the other flow. And I was wondering if you think there are ways of transgressing through the plan or through this act of preparing or designating before the actual act. Yeah.
Thank you. I think it's super interesting question. And honestly, I don't know, but I think that there definitely are. And I think that, and again, that goes back to my original point, that I don't believe that any assumption or any research can be made just for yourself or for a little group of people. But that's why I like, for instance, in my HTS, for instance, here, what I do, I challenge the drawing as a way through which we can think about the conventional way of drawing architecture. The plan, we don't have to abandon necessarily the plan, but we have to abandon the conventional way of conceiving the plan as an instrument of control or as an instrument that allows us to see. It's a vision that is not humane, right? Like the plan ends inevitably to be a diagram, right? Like something that is again, using that really evokes Agamben's words. I think there are tons of ways to do it. And I think the more I've been teaching, the more I've seen this transgressed actually as a more conventional drawing. But that's why I believe that we need to discuss about these things, and in a dialogical way, we can really like find those transgressions somehow together. And I think I've seen it, like, and also in the way, I mean, also did 19 works, there is a constant way of challenging the boundaries of what is understandable as a drawing, as a traditional drawing, and what instead we can invent as something completely new. And yeah, I believe that there are ways. I'm not at all pessimistic. But yeah, thank you for the question. Thank you. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you for the one for sharing. And like if we have, for example, if we invent some let's say plans or diagram which is far from the conventional plans, but do you think like if we are really like practical designing something, in that case we like it that diagram can be like a good illustration of like a brand new thought, but like when we like legit do something, we might have to go back to like the very original kind of plan.
Another very, very good point. And I think, I don't remember if it was in the passage that I gave, that I suggested for the reading. There is a beautiful distinction that Jeremy Thiel makes between practice and profession. The profession, it's what deals with the legislation and the norms that are out there, in which you have to respond to codes and codes of conduct and rules somehow that allow us to speak the same language. That's one thing. The practice is another thing. And what we do in education, I think, is still within the practice of architecture, because we still experiment something that can be challenged after. Not everyone that goes out, I think, of an architecture school goes and work in an office. But I think even within, now I have to be honest with you, I barely practice architecture. I actually probably have done it for a year and in a very small capacity. So I am not, I don't have lots of knowledge about, I mean, I know people that, and I have discussion, of course, with friends that do it. But I think, yes, there is, of course, there is a social structure somehow, if I want to put in Turner's words, that has to follow specific regulation. But that's why I do believe, and I think, I tell you even more, that the reason why these theories, and this is thoughts that I was having very recently, but all these theories from the 80s, you know, from the second half of the 20th century, they hardly can be applied to profession, because the profession is following a completely tangential direction from the one that actually the practice and practice of education does. But what if we instead apply these theories to this kind of fertile ground that is still the practice and education? So maybe we have to make, instead of making distinction between theory and practice, we maybe have to start learning making distinction between the profession and the practice, or really acknowledging there are two ways of like dealing with architecture in the world, in the real world. There is one of the world of building and of course this series of regulations, and one is that of the practice. And maybe at some point these two things can actually then encounter one another. I don't know. But yes, of course we deal with a series of like conventions, but this convention, again, as if you remember, like there is a way in which we can expand that rule. Like if you think about subplan, the project of subplan doesn't deny this convention. It's just using the mistakes, the blank spots, right? Like of the bureaucratic world, and then trying to fill these gaps with something different or more or newer, let's say. It's a basic word.
First of all, thank you so much for the talk. I feel like it's been quite an introspection, just also listening to you, and a lot of the ideas I think resonate to a lot of us. So thank you. I feel like it was very true what you said, that in a sense, architecture becomes a bubble. It's almost like before we come in, we have this peak of reality, and then we work so hard to actually integrate within this bubble, which has its own freedoms but also limitations. And I feel like for me, especially now that I'm going to be spilling out into the world again, kind of finishing architecture, I'm talking to a lot of people, and I see that it's more rare that people say, I want to become an architect and to work in an office. And somehow they go out and do really amazing things. But I find it quite hard to find out what they're actually doing and where they're going with it, in a sense, which is very exciting. But you were talking about this need to contaminate architecture. And it feels like instead of coming back to contaminate it, we almost expand into different fields. And I feel like now there's this very big boundary between what the outside world believes architecture is versus how we redefine it for ourselves. So in a sense, I'm not sure what my question is, but in a sense, do you think that maybe reinventing architecture is more about looking outwards towards these spots as opposed to how things have been going, and what can we actually do about it? Thank you.
It's not an easy question. And thank you. I think you really understood like a lot of like points, which I am constantly having conversation around. Because having been teaching now, I don't teach since a long time. It's just probably is around 6-7 years. But I've been around academia, of course, as a student and then as a teacher. But I have to say, maybe there is something that we need to change again there in the way we actually organize the whole path of education towards architecture. Because I think you're totally right. There is an hyper specialization in all in our profession. So once we get out, like there are people that go and do any sorts of things, and less people actually go and work in offices. But is that acknowledged in the way we teach architecture? That is part of that complexity that I think also what Branzi was saying, academia remains very blind, remains very superficial about. That is part of that complexity, this different emergence of different kind of interests and things that architecture have to deal with, because the crisis of identity that architecture has always undergone now has been then translated into just a separation of these things. But we never or on the opposite, there is this tendency that architects have to control any other discipline, right? Like we speak philosophy, we speak anthropology, we speak economy, we speak sociology, we speak everything, but we forget that actually the lens through which we're looking at all these disciplines is our lens, right? And so I don't know where I'm going with this, but I think it's a very interesting point. But that's why I think it's very important to understand how do we respond in this in-between stage that is education to the reality that the profession and the practice is exposing us to. And of course, I mean, there's lots of ways we can go with, and I think it's an ongoing discussion. I don't have an answer to that. I constantly talk about, for instance, with my teaching partner, like how maybe we need to just divide, for instance, the 3 years and the 2 years. And the 3 years is more like this general approach to the discipline, and the 2 years is more like this, you go out after your year out, you experience the world, and you go back to the 2 years with a more clear definition of what architecture is for you. And then the selection of all the unit in diploma then can be this complete different specialization, for instance, that architecture is facing. I don't know, that's one thought, but there could be millions of those, right? And we can really, I think, maybe have this discussion and really trying to, because, I always thought that the word educator sounds very strange, but I do believe in it a lot. So I don't know, I think it's something that has to be discussed. And I have the feeling that sometimes academia barely changed in so long.
Thank you very much. It was really nice to follow the work, and I think it was really fantastic to follow the trails of the words that you're presenting, and and then it expands, and you kind of focus into certain terms, and then go really deep. So the rhythm that you set was really enjoyable. I have a question, because I think it's almost an extension of the previous question. And it will be about the last video that you concluded with. And I believe that's the students' work, right, at Cambridge. And so the question is actually the framework that you already prepared for the student. I mean, it's, of course, which involves a degree of planning. And I wonder what kind of, framework that was actually given, and, what were the intents behind in the exploration in between. Because my interpretation of the work was that actually it was a bit hard to understand, and maybe that was the point, because it's to be able to not really identify what it's trying to do. And there is this architectural agent picking up the most conventional element, and it can be interpreted in so many ways. And the beautiful drawings that comes out in between the process. And another really important, fact is it doesn't remain as idea. It doesn't or get solidified in a really diagrammatic representation. I think there are various material conditions that actually it keeps on producing. So I thought that was a really beautiful way to end your lecture today. But maybe we want to hear more about the background and your teaching ethos behind it. Thank you.
So very it's very funny, because it was very difficult, I have to say, but not because he was difficult as a student, not at all. It was because we were experimenting something completely different with him, and there were no rules really. So, I mean, I have to make a point actually here that Cambridge has this. So the last term was they have a project every different term. So essentially they have really little time to produce something. We underestimated a lot, like the length of the last term, which is essentially 5 to 6 weeks. So it's literally nothing. So we didn't have much experience of the school. So it was a little bit of like a shock. But in the end, with Ewan, we really gave him carte blanche. We really told him like, so the previous 2 terms, he developed a research which was around this idea that, yes, about the processes of design that becomes the design itself. The second term was essentially about that. But I remember also, so now that Davide is here, but like that we had this discussion in the midterm crit about the big question was for whom we are designing this thing. Again, that question of audience. And I remember we had this discussion during the crit saying like, well, maybe there's no audience. Maybe there's not someone that you're doing this for. Maybe it's actually indulging in the process, maybe also means that. And that was a conflict of ideas for me, because I always believe that architecture has been built for someone by someone. There is always need to be a subject. And then it was really a shock for me, but I went with him and I said like, okay, let's see where this goes. And in the end, the subjects were everyone, all of them, I think, the people that helped me actually help him crossing the road, and the students that then actually built the things with him. So it's a process started from him alone to him with other people. So maybe I have to say there was no plan. So it was, of course, sometimes we said like, maybe this thing should come out as a video, and then maybe we should interval real images with drawing images. That was a sort of like ongoing discussion, but it was very hard also for the examiner to determine something and to say something about that video. Luckily, it was a second year student, so there was not much pressure in the third year for the third year and the portfolio and things. But it was tough for them, but they recognize and embrace really the risk that you really try to put forward. And I'm now continuing working with him on a thesis. So let's see also through the HDS perspective that goes. But I have to say, I really trusted it. We really trusted him. So we just went.
I think we can take maybe 2 more questions. Should we take one from Yonsei if there are any questions there?
Okay, can you hear me? Oh. Okay. Thank you very much for great and very elegant lectures. Actually, I really like the rhythms of your kind of definition or drawings and chord, everything. So actually, those presentations remind me of my projects and my teaching methodology as well. So I have 2 questions, and one is about standard. You mentioned in the middle of presentations. So I think standard is very important thinking or part of architectural discourse. So what is the standard which you are thinking as a starting point to think architecture further, go beyond? And for second, and the in-between is very interesting topic also. I have found so many different spaces or think some areas where I'm looking at as an in-between phenomena or quality. So have you any idea or thought or some investigation about what in-between space is in the city or in the architecture discourse or some project, whatever? Thank you very much.
Thank you. Well, that's a difficult question, the first one, but maybe with the idea of standard could be what I mean as a standard, as a constriction, as a limitation, is this idea of associate a function with a form, let's say. So there is, and that form then can be repeated. Somehow it doesn't take into account that the form can be lived by different subjects and the different subject may live in a different way. So the limitation of form as something repeatable and not interpretable, it's a limitation that architecture has. And of course, the idea of like forms follows function. In terms of the in-between, what the in-between is, I think Ewan's video probably it's the best translation for me of it. And I think that both the bell hooks quote at the end that I used and as a prelude to Ewan's video, they both demonstrate different ideas of in-between. So in one hand, in-between is intended as a process of learning and discovery and mistaking and embracing mistakes and doubts, but is a limited thing, is a limited amount of time. It's not like, it doesn't last forever. So is indulging in a moment of like trying something new to then generate something new. And UN project is entirely, the project is not an outcome, but is a process in that sense. So it really, but as a beginning and an end. So it ends with a series of like different inhabitation of that space that he actually put together. So the in-between is a state of being and of potential change and potential movement. And that's why I recognize it and I compare it within like the act of learning that we do and we have within academia or in architecture academia in this sense, because there's a very specific duration and therefore but then can generate a lot of change, is a very fertile ground. I don't know if I answered well, but thank you.
So thank you, Francesca, for the amazing sharings and all the HDS lectures you gave me in the previous year. We never had the chance to meet in person. So I have questions regarding to a constant dilemma that I have with my friend about the methodology of designing architecture. That's some of my friends argue they design as a design architecture in a speculative way, that they do not take rituals and habits into their considerations. But in my mind, that in order to have a meaningful design, you must have taken the rituals as well as habits into the at least the research part of the design. But they do argue that you can also produce meaningful architectures by mere speculations. So how do you see that, or like, do you have any comments on these two very different design methodologies?
Well, I think if we take Branzi's quote about when he said that architecture is a thought, maybe speculation can be architecture. But again, as I said, like, it's all part of a process. It's all part of the same in-between process somehow of maybe learning and discovering. So maybe the speculation again doesn't live for itself, but lives for a specific audience, live as a mean through which we understand something. In the same way, a project of architecture doesn't end with the actual building or doesn't end with its outcome, but it can generate something potentially different, is an acquired habit somehow, not that can generate an acquired habit, right? So it's a change and proposes a change that can generate something new. So I would not argue that one is architecture and the other is not. In the same way, I began the talk by saying that we always have to doubt everything. And that idea, like, it's not black and white, right? Like, but it's a life in color. So it's, I guess in that sense, yes, maybe it can be architecture. But it's again always about the questioning why and where it might lead and to whom you are actually discussing with that speculation. I don't know, if it makes sense. Yeah. Thank you very much for all the questions.